At 14:23 on September 19, 1944, Corporal Thomas Bennett crouched behind his M5 3-inch anti-tank gun in a hedgerow near Saint-Lô, France, watching 5 German Panther tanks advance across an open field at 800 yards. His hands were shaking. The gun crew had been in position for 6 hours. They had watched the Panzers maneuver all morning, waiting for them to get close enough for a clean shot. Now the moment had arrived, and Bennett knew the textbook approach would get them all killed. The M5 was a good gun, powerful, accurate. You could punch through 3 inches of armor at 1,000 yards when fired correctly. But correctly meant firing at a depression angle of -5 degrees or an elevation angle of no more than 15 degrees. Those were the angles the gun was designed for. The angles every gunnery manual specified. Fire outside those parameters and you risk damaging the recoil mechanism, possibly destroying the gun, definitely voiding any maintenance warranty. The problem was the terrain, the hedgerow. Bennett's gun was elevated 12 feet above the field. The Panthers were advancing through a shallow depression. To hit them using the approved firing angles, Bennett would have to wait until they climbed out of the depression and came within 300 yards, maybe closer. At that range, the Panthers could see his muzzle, could target his position, could destroy his gun with their first shot. The Panther tank was one of the most dangerous armored vehicles on the battlefield. Its front armor was 80 millimeters thick, sloped at 55 degrees. That slope made shells deflect instead of penetrating. The M5 could penetrate that armor, but only if the shell struck at the perfect angle, and only if Bennett fired before the Panther gunners saw him. Behind Bennett stood the gun commander, Second Lieutenant James Walsh, 24 years old, 8 weeks in France. Walsh had read the manual. He knew the approved procedures. He was telling Bennett to wait for the pet to get closer, wait for the proper firing angle, wait for the textbook shot. Bennett had been a gunner for 11 months. He had served in North Africa before France. He had fired at German tanks 23 times, hit 17, but he had never tried what he was thinking about now, never violated the elevation limits, never risked destroying his own gun to get a shot. The manual was clear, maximum elevation 50 degrees. Anything more could snap the recoil springs, crack them out, turn a functional anti-tank gun into scrap metal. But Bennett had spent the last 6 hours calculating angles, estimating distances, watching the Panthers move. He knew where they were going, knew the depression they were moving through would keep them below his sight line for another 8 minutes. After that, they would be too close. His crew would not survive. There was one way to hit them now. Elevate the gun to 32 degrees, fire at a high trajectory, drop the shell onto the thinner top arm of the Panther. The Panther's top armor was only 40 millimeters thick. A 3-inch armor-piercing shell coming down at a steep angle would punch through easily. The problem was the elevation, 32 degrees, more than double the approved maximum. The recoil forces would be enormous. The gun might survive 1 shot, maybe 3. Eventually something would break the springs, the mount, the traverse mechanism, and then they would be defenseless with 5 Panthers bearing down on them. Wall was still telling him to wait, follow doctrine, fire at the approved angle. Bennett looked at his loader, Private Rodriguez, a 20-year-old kid from Texas. He had been with the crew for 2 months. Fast loader, good soldier, scared out of his mind. Bennett made a decision that would either save his crew or get him court-martialed. He elevated the gun to 32 degrees. The German Panther tank was the most dangerous armored vehicle American troops faced in France during the summer and fall of 1944. It was not the heaviest tank in the war. That distinction belonged to the Tiger, but the Panther was more common, more mobile, and in many ways more lethal. By September 1944, the German 5th Panzer Army had nearly 200 Panthers operational in Normandy and northern France. American anti-tank crews encountered them constantly. The Panther's armor design made it extremely difficult to destroy from the front. The 80mm frontal plate sloped sharply, meaning shells hit at an angle and often ricocheted. Even when a shell penetrated, the sloped armor absorbed much of the impact. American 3-inch anti-tank guns could defeat that armor, but only at close range, usually under 500 yards. At that distance, the Panther's 75mm gun could destroy an American gun position with a single shot. The math was brutal. To kill a Panther from the front, you had to let it get close enough to kill you first. Bennett had watched this happen again and again. 7 times in North Africa, 4 times already in France. Gun crews waited for Panthers to close to textbook range. Sometimes they fired first, sometimes they hit, but the Panther almost always got a shot back, and Panther gunners rarely missed. German optics were excellent. Their gunners were highly trained. If they saw your muzzle flash, you had maybe 8 seconds before a 75mm shell came screaming toward your position. In North Africa, Bennett's battalion had 14 anti-tank guns in 3 weeks fighting Panthers and Tigers. Most were destroyed after firing their first or second shot. The crews died with him. Bennett survived only because his gun had once been positioned behind a ridge that allowed the crew to escape after firing. That kind of position was rare. Most anti-tank crews did not get a second chance. They fired once, maybe twice, then the enemy fired back. Bennett kept the gun elevated at 32 degrees. For a moment, no one moved. The battlefield was quiet except for the low grinding rumble of German tank engines. 5 Panthers were advancing steadily across the field, their long 75mm guns pointed forward, scanning the hedgerows ahead for American anti-tank positions. They had no idea Bennett's crew was already aiming at them. Behind Bennett, Lieutenant Walsh was still arguing. "Lower the barrel," he said sharply. "That angle will destroy the recoil system." Bennett didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on sight. The lead Panther was moving exactly where he expected to. 750 yards away, still inside the depression, still below the hedgerow line, still unable to see the American gun, Rodriguez slid a 20-pound armor-piercing shell into the breech. The loader slammed the mechanism shut with a metallic clank. "Up," Rodriguez said. Bennett adjusted the sight slightly. He had spent the entire morning studying the terrain, estimating distances, calculating angles in his head. His math was wrong. The shell would land far behind the Panther or fall short. And once the Germans saw the muzzle flash, the engagement would be over. Walsh leaned closer. "Bennett, I'm ordering you." Bennett fired. The recoil was violent. At normal elevation angles, the M5 anti-tank gun recoiled smoothly backward along its rails. But at 32 degrees, the recoil forces shifted dramatically. Instead of sliding back evenly, the gun kicked upward like a wild animal. The entire mount shook. Metal screamed. The recoil springs compressed harder than they ever had before. For a split second, Bennett thought the whole assembly would rip apart. Then the barrel snapped forward again. Smoke drifted from the muzzle. And the shell was already climbing into the sky. Bennett lost sight of it almost immediately. The projectile arced upward through the gray September clouds. This was not how anti-tank guns were supposed to work. Direct fire weapons were designed for flat trajectory. Artillery fire belonged to howitzers, not anti-tank guns, but Bennett had calculated the arc in his head. Elevation distance gravity. If his estimates were correct, the shell would reach nearly 200 feet above the target before beginning its descent. Then gravity would take over, pulling the shell downward toward the Panther's thin top armor. 3 seconds, and the Panther continued rolling forward. Its commander was standing halfway out of the turret hatch, scanning the hedgerow. He was looking for threats at ground level, looking for muzzle flashes from concealed gun. You never thought to look up for a second. Bennett counted silently. 6 seconds. Behind him, Walsh stopped walking. Everyone in the gun crew was staring at the tank, waiting. 7 seconds, then the shell hit. The armor-piercing projectile struck the Panther's engine deck at a steep angle. The impact sounded like a hammer striking steel. The 40mm armor plate offered almost no resistance. The shell punched straight through. Inside the engine compartment, it smashed through fuel lines and oil systems. Hot metal fragments sprayed everywhere. Engine oil ignited instantly. Flames burst from the rear of the tank. The Panther lurched forward a few yards, then stopped. Black smoke poured from the engine deck. For a moment, the battlefield was silent. The other 4 Panthers halted. Their commanders were trying to understand what had just happened. They had heard the gun, but the angle didn't make sense. Anti-tank guns fired from ground level, not from above. The shell had clearly struck from a steep downward angle, but that was impossible. Rodriguez was already loading the second shell. His hands moved automatically, training and adrenaline taking over. 20 pounds of steel slammed into the breech. The mechanism locked up. Bennett was already aiming at the second Panther. Same elevation, same trajectory. The gun was still intact. The recoil springs snapped. He squeezed the trigger again. The second recoil was even more violent than the first. The mount shuddered. The springs groaned under the strain, but the gun held together. Again, the shell arced high into the sky. 8 seconds later, it came down on the second Panther's turret roof. The armor there was only 25mm thick, designed to stop artillery fragments, not direct hits from armor-piercing shells. The projectile punched through instantly. Inside the turret, ricocheted through the cramped fighting compartment. Steel fragments tore through the crew. The Panther stopped moving. Black smoke began pouring from the commander's hatch. Now the German tank crews understood. They weren't being attacked from ground level. They were being hit from above. The remaining Panthers began reversing immediately, trying to escape the depression, trying to reach higher ground. But Panthers were heavy machines, nearly 60 tons. They didn't move quickly in reverse. Bennett had time for one more shot, maybe 2. Rodriguez slammed another shell into the breech. Bennett adjusted his aim slightly. The third Panther was backing away. He had to lead the target, account for the movement he fired. The third shell struck the Panther's turret ring, the thin gap between the turret and the hull. One of the weakest structural points on the entire tank. The shell didn't fully penetrate, but the impact damaged the turret's rotation mechanism. The turret jammed in place. The Panther could still move, but it could no longer aim its gun. 20 seconds later, the German crew bailed out, climbing from the hatches and running for cover. The last 2 Panthers escaped. They climbed out of the depression and disappeared behind a ridge. The engagement was over. 3 Panthers destroyed or disabled. 90 seconds of combat, 0 return fire. The American gun crew stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Rodriguez was breathing heavily. His hands were shaking again. Lieutenant Walsh stared at Bennett. Finally, he asked a simple question. "How did you know?" Bennett shrugged. "I didn't." He paused. "I just did the math." Within an hour, other anti-tank crews from the battalion were arriving at Bennett's position. They had seen the engagement through binoculars. They had watched the shells arc high into the air. watched them fall onto the Panthers from above. None of them had ever seen anything like it. One of the gunners asked Bennett, "Explain the angles." Another asked about the recoil stress. Bennett showed them. He described the trajectory, the elevation, the way gravity accelerated the shell during its descent. He also warned them the gun might break. He said, "The recoil springs can't handle this forever." One gunner nodded. "That's fine," he said. "Guns can be replaced." He glanced at the burned-out Panthers in the field. "Crewmen can't." Over the next 3 days, the technique spread quietly through the battalion. Gunner to gunner, crew to crew. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody reported it to headquarters. They simply shared the math. 32 degrees for targets between 700 and 900 yards. Slightly less for closer targets. Adjust for wind. Aim for the engine deck or turret roof. Fire. And pray the gun survived the recoil. By September 22nd, 9 anti-tank guns in the battalion were using high-angle fire against Panthers. The results were immediate. Engagement ranges increased. Were being destroyed before they could return fire. American crews were surviving battles that would have killed them a week earlier. The official manual still said the maximum elevation was 15 degrees. But on the battlefield, the manuals were no longer in charge. Experience was, and experience had just rewritten the rules of anti-tank warfare. Word about Bennett's strange firing method spread faster than anyone expected. At first, it moved quietly between gun crews, a conversation beside a truck, a quick explanation over a map, a demonstration with a protractor scratched into the dirt. But by the fourth day, officers were hearing about it too. Some were impressed, others were furious. Because according to the official field manuals, what Bennett had done was reckless, dangerous, and technically a violation of Army procedure. The U.S. Army Field Manual for the M5 3-inch anti-tank gun clearly stated the maximum firing elevation was 15 degrees. That limit existed for a reason. The recoil system was not built for steep angles. Every time a gun fired above 15 degrees, the recoil springs absorbed enormous stress. Too much stress could snap them. If that happened during combat, the gun would be useless, and the crew operating it would be exposed to enemy armor with no way to defend themselves. From the perspective of headquarters, the manual was designed to prevent exactly that situation. But the battlefield rarely followed manuals, and the men fighting every day understood something the writers of the manual did not. Survival sometimes required breaking the rules. 2 days after the St. Lo engagement, Bennett's battalion commander arrived to investigate. Colonel Harold McIntyre had served in armored warfare since 1941. He was not a man who liked surprises, especially surprises involving damaged equipment. He walked slowly around Bennett's gun position. The weapon still looked functional, but the recoil springs showed clear signs of strain. Mounting bracket had developed a small crack. McIntyre crouched beside the gun and examined the metal carefully. "How many times did you fire at that angle?" he asked honestly. 3 shots during the engagement, not any practice shots. 2 yesterday. The colonel stood up. "That's 5 times beyond the design limit."
"Yes, sir."
McIntyre folded his arms.
"And the gun still works?" "Yes, sir." The colonel stared at the burned-out Panthers still sitting in the field. Then he asked the question everyone had been thinking, "Could you do it again?"
That afternoon, Bennett demonstrated the technique.
The battalion had captured an abandoned German armored vehicle a mile away. It would serve as a target. Several officers gathered to watch. Some were skeptical, others were curious. Bennett elevated the gun to 30 degrees. Rodriguez loaded a shell. The gun fired. 6 seconds later, the projectile crashed directly through the turret roof of the abandoned vehicle. The metal tore open like a tin can. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Colonel McIntyre nodded slowly. "Well," he said quietly, "that's useful." The colonel did not officially approve that he couldn't. Army regulations were strict about modifying weapon usage. But he also didn't forbid it. Instead, he issued a careful statement to the battalion's officers. "Use your judgment," he said, "if the situation requires it." Those words were enough. Within a week, the entire anti-tank battalion adopted high-angle fire. Crews began experimenting with different elevations, different distances, different aiming points on German tanks. They discovered something important. The top armor of most German tanks was surprisingly thin. Even the massive Tiger tank had only about 25 millimeters of armor on its turret roof. That was enough to stop artillery fragments, but not a direct armor-piercing shell dropping from above. The technique became known informally among the crews as plunging fire. The idea was simple. Instead of trying to punch through the thick frontal armor of a tank, you attacked the weakest point, the roof. Gravity did have to work. The shell gained speed as it descended, and the steep angle made penetration easier. It was not perfect. The accuracy was lower than normal direct fire. Wind affected the shell's arc. Distance estimates had to be precise, but when it worked, the results were devastating. By late September, the battalion had recorded 12 confirmed Panther kills using plunging fire. Even more surprising was the survival rate of the gun crews. In previous months, anti-tank crews often lost their guns after firing only 1 or 2 shots. German tanks would spot the muzzle flash and immediately return fire. But plunging fire changed the geometry of the fight. The gun crews could remain hidden behind ridges or hedgerows. The shells rose high into the air before descending. German tank crews often had no idea where the shots were coming. Several captured German soldiers later described the phenomenon. One Panther driver told American interrogators, "We thought we were being hit by artillery." Another described shells falling almost vertically onto their tanks. Some German units began reporting a mysterious new American weapon. One report referred to it as steep trajectory anti-tank artillery. In reality, it was just ordinary guns used in an unconventional way. Of course, the method had risks. After about 15 high shots, most M5 guns began showing mechanical problems. Recoil springs stretched, mounts loosened, sights shifted slightly out of alignment. Several guns eventually failed completely. Crews didn't mind. A destroyed gun could be replaced. A dead crew could not. As one sergeant put it bluntly, "I'd rather break the gun than bury my loader." The tactic continued spreading beyond Bennett's battalion. Infantry units started hearing about it. Other anti-tank units began trying it themselves. Even some tank crews experimented with firing their main guns at steeper angles. Not every attempt succeeded. Some shells missed completely. Others landed harmlessly beside the target, but enough work to prove the concept. The battlefield was evolving, and the Germans were starting to notice. German intelligence officers began collecting reports from tank units describing unusual shell impacts. Several Panthers had been destroyed by hits on the engine deck or turret roof. The angle of impact suggested the shells were coming from above, but Allied aircraft were not present during the engagements, and artillery observers had not reported firing missions in the area. The explanation puzzled them until one captured American soldier mentioned something during interrogation. He described anti-tank crews firing their guns at extremely steep angles. The German officers dismissed the idea at first. Anti-tank guns were not designed for that. The recoil systems would fail, but the battle evidence told a different story. Panthers were being destroyed, and the pattern of damage pointed directly to attacks from above. German engineers began studying the problem. They quickly realized something unsettling. The top armor of their tanks had never been designed to withstand direct hits from armor-piercing shells. The assumption had always been that enemy guns would fire horizontally. Now that assumption was being challenged, and the results were costly. Back in Bennett's unit, technique continued improving. Crews built crude angle markers onto their gun mounts. Some used small wooden wedges to stabilize the elevation mechanism. Others experimented with indirect aiming methods using landmarks. What started as a desperate battlefield improvisation was slowly becoming a system, a dangerous one, but a highly effective one, and Bennett himself had become something of a legend within the battalion. Not because he broke the rules, but because he survived long enough to prove the rules could be changed. By early October 1944, the strange reports coming from the front lines were no longer being ignored by German command. Tank crews from several Panzer divisions had submitted similar after-action reports. Panthers destroyed by impacts on their engine decks, turret roofs pierced by armor-piercing shells, damage patterns suggesting the shells had struck from steep downward angles. At first, German officers assumed the cause was Allied artillery, but artillery shells left different damage signatures, fragments, wide blast patterns, shrapnel scars. The Panthers being destroyed in northern France showed something else entirely. Clean penetration holes, armor-piercing impacts, direct hits from solid projectiles. Someone in the American Army had discovered a new way to attack tanks, and it was working. At a German field headquarters near Metz, intelligence officers gathered several damaged Panther turrets for examination. Engineers studied the entry holes carefully. They measured angles, examined the metal deformation, calculated the trajectory of the shells. One engineer made a disturbing observation. If this shell came from ground level, he said, the angle would be impossible. Another engineer disagreed, unless the gun was fired from elevated terrain, but the battlefield map showed something else. Many of the attacks had occurred in flat countryside. There were no hills tall enough to create those angles. The only explanation left was troubling. The Americans were deliberately firing their guns at extreme elevation, using gravity to drop the shells onto the tanks. The discovery created immediate concern inside German armored units. For years, German tank design had focused heavily on frontal protection. The thick, sloped armor of the Panther was designed specifically to defeat direct anti-tank fire. From the front, it worked extremely well. Most Allied anti-tank guns struggled to penetrate it at long range, but the roof of the tank had never been expected to take direct hits from armor-piercing shells. The roof armor existed mainly to stop artillery fragments and machine gun fire from aircraft, not anti-tank rounds dropping from the sky. If the Americans had truly found a way to exploit that weakness, every Panther on the battlefield had suddenly become more vulnerable. German commanders began issuing temporary defensive instructions to their tank crews. Whenever possible, Panthers were ordered to avoid depressions in the terrain. They were told to maintain positions where enemy guns could not easily fire from elevated angles. Tank commanders were also instructed to watch the sky carefully during combat. If they saw shells climbing into the air before descending, they were to change position immediately. But in the chaos of battle, such precautions were difficult to maintain. Tank warfare moved quickly. Crews rarely had time to analyze shell trajectories, and American anti-tank crews were becoming better at hiding their positions. Meanwhile, in Bennett's battalion, the plunging fire technique was evolving even further. The original 32-degree elevation Bennett used was just a starting point. Other crews experimented with slightly different angles depending on terrain and distance. They discovered that small adjustments could improve accuracy. At distances between 700 and 900 yards, angles between 28 and 34 degrees worked best. Closer targets required slightly lower elevation. Longer distances required higher Rs. Some crews even began using improvised range tables. They scratched numbers into wooden boards attached to the gun mounts. Distance estimates, elevation suggestions, wind adjustments. None of it came from official manuals. It was all battlefield improvisation, but it worked. The biggest advantage of plunging fire was surprise. German tank crews expected anti-tank fire to come from eye level. They watched hedgerows, buildings, tree lines. They did not expect shells to rise high into the sky before falling directly onto their tanks. By the time many German crews realized what was happening, it was already too late. A shell would slam into the turret roof or punch through the engine deck, and the tank would erupt in flames. Within 3 weeks, Bennett's battalion recorded 21 confirmed tank kills using high-angle fire. Even more important, their own casualty rate dropped dramatically. Before the technique spread, anti-tank often lost multiple guns in a single engagement. Panthers could spot and destroy them quickly, but plunging fire allowed the American guns to stay hidden longer. Many German tank crews never located the source of the attack. They simply withdrew from the area after losing 1 or 2 vehicles. From a tactical perspective, that alone counted as victory. Of course, the method still had mechanical limits. Several M5 guns eventually failed under the strain of repeated high-angle firing. Spring snapped, mounts cracked. One gun even suffered a damaged breech mechanism after its 17th plunging shot, but the crews accepted those risks. Maintenance teams repaired the guns when possible. When they couldn't, replacement guns arrived from supply depots. The Army had plenty of equipment. Experienced crews were far harder to replace. By mid-October, the technique had spread to other American anti-tank battalions operating in France. Some units learned about it through informal conversations between soldiers. Others heard about it through after-action reports. The method was never officially added to the manuals during the war, but many experienced gunners quietly adopted it anyway. It became one of those battlefield secrets that soldiers passed along through experience rather than formal training. Meanwhile, German engineers began considering design changes for future tanks. Some proposed increasing the thickness of turret roofs. Others suggested adding additional armor plates over vulnerable engine decks. But by late 1944, Germany's industrial resources were stretched thin. Factories were already struggling to keep up with production demands. Major design changes were difficult to implement quickly, and the war was moving too fast. The Americans and their allies were advancing across France. Every week brought new battles, new tank engagements, new reports of shells falling from above. Back near the hedgerow where it all started, Bennett's crew settled into a routine. Rodriguez still loaded shells with the same speed and focus as before. Lieutenant Walsh had stopped arguing about elevation limits. Even he now understood the value of the tactic. One evening after a patrol, Walsh walked over to Bennett's position and leaned against the gun. "You realize," he said quietly, "that technically this still violates every manual in the Army." Bennett smiled slightly. "Yes, sir." Walsh nodded toward the distant battlefield where burned-out German tanks still sat abandoned. Then maybe the manuals need rewriting. Bennett never thought of himself as an innovator. To him, the decision that day near St. Lo had simply been a calculation, a desperate attempt to survive against a superior armored vehicle. But the idea he tested had revealed something important about warfare. Sometimes the greatest advantage does not come from new weapons. It comes from using existing weapons in ways no one expected, and that lesson will continue shaping battlefield tactics long after World War II ended. By November 1944, the front lines in Western Europe had shifted dramatically. Allied forces were pushing deeper into France and approaching the German border. The battles were still intense, and German armored units continued fighting hard, but the momentum of the war had begun to change. Before the new firing technique appeared, many anti-tank gunners believed their job was little more than a death sentence. They were expected to sit in concealed positions and wait for enemy tanks to approach within deadly range. Sometimes they destroyed the tank first, other times the tank destroyed them. The difference between victory and death often came down to seconds, but plunging fire had shifted that balance. It allowed gun crews to attack from safer positions instead of waiting for. Thanks to close to 300 or 400 yards, they could engage targets much earlier, 700 yards, 800 yards, sometimes even further. The extra distance gave them something they rarely had before: time to fire, time to reload. Time to disappear before the enemy could react. Across several American anti-tank battalions, unofficial records showed the same pattern. Units that experimented with steep-angle firing reported higher success rates against German armor. More destroyed Panthers, fewer destroyed guns, fewer casualties among the crews. No one at headquarters formally ordered the technique to be adopted, but experienced gunners understood its value immediately. Combat veterans rarely ignored anything that helped them survive. During the winter fighting near the German border, plunging fire appeared in several engagements. In some cases, the technique was used only once during a battle. In others, it became the main method of engaging enemy armor. Results were not always perfect. Weather sometimes interfered with visibility. Snow and wind affected shell trajectories, and estimating distances in rough terrain was never easy. But when the calculations were correct, the effect was dramatic. German tanks that felt nearly invulnerable from the front suddenly became vulnerable again. The thick frontal armor of the Panther no longer guaranteed protection. The weakest point on the tank had become the most dangerous one. German command continued trying to adapt. Some tank crews began covering their engine decks with spare track links or sandbags in an attempt to strengthen the thin armor. Others tried to avoid open depressions where shells could drop down onto their vehicles. But battlefield conditions rarely allowed perfect defensive positioning, and even improvised armor provided only limited protection. A high-velocity armor-piercing shell still carried enormous energy when descending from above if the impact angle was steep enough. Even reinforced areas could be penetrated. By early 1945, Germany's armored forces were struggling to replace their losses. Fuel shortages limited tank movement. Factories were damaged by bombing. Experienced crews were becoming scarce. At that stage of the war, every lost tank mattered. Every destroyed Panther reduced Germany's ability to resist the Allied advance. And every surviving American anti-tank crew meant one more experienced unit still fighting on the battlefield. The final months of the war brought fewer large armored battles in the West, but anti-tank crews continued using every trick they had learned. The battlefield had taught them many lessons. Camouflage mattered, patience mattered, positioning mattered, but sometimes the most valuable lesson was simple creativity. The ability to look at a weapon and imagine using it differently. That was the moment when tactics changed. For Corporal Thomas Bennett, life during the last months of the war settled into a strange routine. His crew moved from position to position as the front advanced. They repaired their guns several times after heavy use. Once they replaced an entire recoil spring assembly after repeated high-angle firing damaged the original one. But the gun kept working, and Bennett's crew kept surviving. They destroyed several more German vehicles during the winter fighting. Not every kill came from plunging fire, but the option was always there. Backup method, a reminder that sometimes battlefield allowed more possibilities than the manuals suggested. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, Bennett's battalion had recorded dozens of confirmed armored kills. Not all of them came from steep-angle fire, but enough did that the technique had earned quiet respect among the men who had used it. No official report credited Bennett as the inventor of the idea. Military history rarely records small tactical innovations made by individual soldiers in the heat of battle, but among the gun crews who had seen the results firsthand, the story of that first engagement near St. Lo was never forgotten. 3 Panthers destroyed in 90 seconds, using a firing angle the manual said should never be used. In the years after World War II, military engineers around the world began studying ways to attack tanks from above. They understood something that battlefield improvisations like Bennett's had demonstrated clearly. The top of a tank is almost always its weakest point. Vehicle can carry thick armor on every surface. Weight limits make that impossible. As tanks became stronger and better protected from the front and sides, engineers began developing weapons specifically designed to strike from above. Missiles that climbed high into the air before descending onto their targets. Guided projectiles that attacked turret roofs. Weapons that use gravity and angle to defeat heavy armor. Modern anti-tank systems eventually adopted the same principle Bennett had improvised in 1944. Instead of hitting the strongest part of the tank, aim for the weakest. Attack from above, where the armor is thinnest. Today, many advanced anti-tank weapons use what is called top attack guidance. These systems launch missiles that rise above the battlefield and then dive down toward the target. When the warhead detonates, it focuses enormous energy directly onto the thin roof armor of the vehicle. The concept is remarkably similar to the improvised plunging fire technique used by anti-tank crews during World War II. Technology has changed. Weapons have become far more sophisticated, but the core idea remains the same. Angle matters, gravity matters. And sometimes the most powerful attack comes from a direction the enemy never expected. Corporal Thomas Bennett returned home after the war like millions of other soldiers. He rarely talked about the battles he had fought. To him, the strange shot fired near St. Lo had simply been a decision made under pressure. A calculation made in seconds. One of many moments where survival depended on instinct and experience. But somewhere in the long chain of military history, that moment mattered, because it proved something important. Innovation does not always come from laboratories or design offices. Sometimes it comes from a soldier behind a gun, watching the battlefield, studying the terrain, and asking a simple question: what happens if I try something different?